Well, today we're welcoming Peggy Grande to the Making Reagan show. And Peggy worked closely with Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan after the presidency and just has great insights. And we've relied on her counsel over the years. So, Peggy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. Good to see you.
Well, you have carved out quite a career for yourself in the last, I don't know, since I've known you even. It's been amazing to see you doing op-eds and traveling around the world. And before we get into Ronald Reagan, tell us what you've been up to.
Well, it has been a crazy ride. I always was fascinated and interested in politics, but Ronald Reagan's post-presidency office, as you know, wasn't even necessarily very political, although we engaged in a lot of political activities. But I guess I got bit by the political bug while I was there and have spent the last 10 or 15 years, as you said, traveling the world, primarily to allied countries, Australia, New Zealand, obviously in the UK, all over Europe, talking about democracy and about freedom. And obviously that came from my former boss, and to be involved in projects like World for Brexit and to lead that on behalf of a global organization was a fantastic experience. And it's been interesting trying to find my own voice as well. You know, for so many years, I wrote for Ronald Reagan and learned to write and speak in his voice. And it was a very interesting transition trying to find what my voice was and what I thought based on the foundation that he had given me. He's, as you know, not somebody who gives a list of rules or ideas, but just the very essence of who he is and how he lives his life can't help but change you. And I do feel like the luckiest woman in the world to have sat by his feet for so many years and to have been able to take that and to launch a fascinating and exciting career all over the world. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, we have so much ground to cover with you, but before we go there, I just want to talk about. I think you and I figured out at lunch one day that we had probably met before because I got in to visit President Reagan in '96 or '97, somewhere in there. And I just remember somebody like you, and I'm pretty sure it was you, kind of ushered me in. And you were speaking in very soothing tones to the president. I remember it was like, Mr. President, Mark Joseph is here to see you. It was, I don't want to say a child, but it was a very reassuring tone that you had. And I think you took my picture afterwards, our picture together.
Probably did.
Right, isn't it?
Yeah, and working for him over the course of 10 years, starting right after he left the White House and came to LA, and working with him until he left the public eye, there certainly were a lot of transitions and phases and chapters of those 10 years that occurred, and learning to adapt to those and to support him in the best way I knew possible looked very different at the beginning than it did at the end. And of course, even after he left the public eye, he lived another 5 years. And I was so grateful to Mrs. Reagan for always having an open door policy. And so I got to continue to stay connected with President Reagan up until the time he passed away, and with Mrs. Reagan as well until she passed away in 2016. So 27 years of my life, starting as a college student, was really interwoven with the Reagans, and what incredible people they were. I learned so much from them. And of course, they changed the trajectory of my life forever.
So tell me what that process was like. So I'm just Joe Schmo, average citizen, made an appointment to see the president. Now, as I understand it, you guys were scheduling people that he had never met before. Is that right? Because then it wouldn't make him feel like he was trying to remember who it was. And what was that process like, and how did it go on, and how long did it go on for?
Yeah, not necessarily. He met with a wide range of people, everybody from, the building maintenance crew that cleaned his office every night to world leaders. He met with a lot of people that had just written into the office who wanted an opportunity to meet him. He met with a lot of people who had worked for him in the past. And so it was very much a mix of new and old, young and old, and a variety of people. And so he really liked to stay connected to people, as you know, as much as he was very thoughtful and introverted in a lot of ways. He loved the opportunity and never lost the fact that he was so fortunate and blessed to have been given the opportunity to serve as president, and constantly wanted to give back to people by inviting people into his office. And so,
More
you
specific.
know what it was like when you come into his office, as intimidating as a place like that is. He had a warmth and a graciousness and a charisma about him that really put people at ease. And that was what he wanted. And that was always my goal, was to answer questions ahead of time, calm people's nerves so that they could really just bring their best side and enjoy the moment and savor it. Because unfortunately, so many people walked out and said, did I do okay? I don't even know what I said. I hope I remember anything that happened, because it was all just kind of a blur. But
I
he
just
did
more
that to people.
specific. What I meant was in the post Alzheimer's years. Was there a change then? Did you not want people that he knew after that?
That wasn't necessarily a criteria. I think we just wanted a little more flexibility in the schedule. So if the day wasn't going great, we could cut the day short if it needed to. But really, it was just a matter of making sure he was always comfortable and at ease. And that was always the priority. And so whatever we had to do to accommodate that, he wanted life to continue as best as it could, as long as it could. And so we definitely took our cues from him and from Mrs. Reagan in that regard. And especially as a young person, that really impacted me, because something like Alzheimer's, you would think would be a death sentence in essence. And the two of them were very committed to walking through that process very transparently, very publicly, and very open. And as a result, it brought so much awareness and research money, and removed a lot of the stigma and the shame of other families who were dealing with Alzheimer's at the time. And so, in true public service fashion, they were terrific about doing that, and even sharing something so difficult with the American people and with the world.
Well, we have violated the laws of linear podcasting here. So let me go backwards now and go back to, first of all, you're a college student at Pepperdine, I believe. And
Right.
how did you go about going from a college student at Pepperdine to being the assistant to Ronald Reagan?
Well, it has to have been meant to be, because there's no other way to explain it. God had a plan and a purpose, and I was the luckiest woman in the world to be chosen to be part of that plan. But as I mentioned before, I was always a kid who just loved politics and government, and was just fascinated by the presidency and first ladies. I grew up in Orange County, California. It might as well have been a million miles from Washington, D.C. My family was not political at all, although back in the day, Orange County, it was all card carrying Republicans. And so was raised in a very conservative home socially and politically, but really not engaged in the political arena at all. Very middle class family of educators, but it was just a fascination and more of a hobby of mine. So I went to college at Pepperdine. Didn't even study political science, because didn't think that there would ever be a chance that I would have a career or future in politics. So studied communications and business. And of course, when I was in college, the great communicator was in the White House. And so I think I wrote every paper on the great communicator in one of his speeches, until my professors said, you have to write about somebody else. But in Ronald Reagan was this perfect convergence of everything I loved. He was a man of faith, of optimism. He laid out an incredible vision for the country and invited us all to be part of it. And he just had a way of connecting with people. When he spoke through the lens of the camera and came into your living room on one of those 3 channels that we had on the dial TVs, you felt like he was talking just to you. And so I was very captivated by him as a politician, as a president. And when he moved back to LA after leaving the White House, his office was not too far from Pepperdine. And I thought about what my dad had always raised me to believe. And he said, somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. So I took a chance and wrote a letter to the office of Ronald Reagan, never expecting to even hear from them. You know, back in the day on a typewriter, lick a stamp, put it on an envelope. Never thought I would even hear from them. To my surprise, one day in my dorm room, my phone rings. It's a woman from the office of Ronald Reagan inviting me in for an interview. I was very excited, but very nervous, of course, when I went in. Thought I had a great conversation, but you never know how that goes. And you just picture thousands of people have applied for the same job. And my brush with greatness, which would have been the most exciting day of my life and probably would have satisfied me forever, was when I was leaving the interview. I was sitting in the lobby of the office and kind of taking a deep breath and a deep exhale. She was going to give me parking validations, because as you know, parking in LA is so expensive, especially as a college student. And wouldn't you know, the doors on the opposite end of the lobby open, and out walks Ronald Reagan, flanked by United States Secret Service, heading right toward me. And I panic. I didn't grow up in an environment like this. I didn't know what to do. I had never, for some reason, prepared myself for what I would do if I saw him. It was as if it never occurred to me that Ronald Reagan would actually work in the office of Ronald Reagan, but here he was walking toward me. So I completely embarrassed myself. I wanted to be very non-threatening and respectful. So I thought about what I would do if the flag was passing by. So I stood up and I put my hand over my heart and just kind of looked off into the distance very non-threateningly and looked, I'm sure, completely ridiculous. But Ronald Reagan walked right toward me, looked me in the eyes, shook my hand. I introduced myself to him, and just what a magical moment. And as embarrassed as I was, I love that moment because I got to see that moment then over the next 10 years so many times when people got that magical moment to meet him for the first time. So I was hired that day to work as an intern, finishing my final semester of college. As I graduated from college, they offered me a full-time staff position. I served as the executive assistant to the chief of staff for a few years. And then Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant he had had since he was in the governor years, retired, and they asked me to take that job. And you don't say no to a job opportunity like that. But I was 6 months pregnant with my first baby and wasn't quite sure how I was going to navigate all that. But over the course of the next 10 years, from 89 to 99, I served Ronald Reagan. I got married. I had 3 of my 4 children. And so they were busy, chaotic, demanding, stressful, wonderful, a decade of life that has changed my life forever.
By the way, it just occurs to me that your story really brings up an interesting aspect of what it is to be a woman and a mom, and a person working in today's world, right? And I have these conversations with my daughters often that you can't always have everything at the same time, but you can usually have everything spaced out. And it seems like you could have easily given up your job and stayed home, but you didn't. You kept at it, but then you raised your kids after 99, then you're back at it now. Just talk about that journey of the challenges of juggling. And I think these are unique issues with a woman, I think, with a mom.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a bit and how you've navigated those issues over these last 20, 30 years, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not easy and it's not for everyone. And I completely respect a woman's choice to work at home because that is the highest and most noble calling. And I certainly have done that mostly full time, some years of my life as well. But I think we need to listen to what our calling is. And I felt very called to be there. I felt like that was part of my purpose and my mission and my ministry in life as a Christian, especially. And so when you're where you're supposed to be, I won't say it's magical, but God helps make it work. And so those years, even though on paper, and actually I look back and think, how did we do that? That was insane. But when you're where you're supposed to be, I think that things do work out. I, of course, had incredible support from my husband, from family, from, great sitters over the years that, were tolerant when I ran late or needed to drop off early, or even when kids were sick to take them. And so it really does take a team of people to allow that to happen. But I loved my work. And as difficult as it was, I never regretted being there. And so I felt very called to it. And I felt like I was the luckiest woman in the world to have an opportunity to have a family and to have a career at the same time. Now, after 10 years of working in the president's office, when the president no longer came to the office, even though he was still living, then that was a good time for me to maybe spend a little more time at home. I had 3 little kids. We eventually had a 4th. I had moved quite a ways from the office, and I write about in my book this feeling of the wheels were kind of falling off. And after 10 years of it working out for the most part very smoothly, I felt this strong urge pulling me home. And I didn't need to work for the government at that point. My job had been him. And so with him no longer there, it really changed my feeling and the dynamic of our family. And so I like to say I retired at the age of, I think I was 33 or something, but retired after 10 years of government service and did spend the next 8 or 10 years primarily at home. Still did a lot of projects, consulting, writing, historical based projects, a lot of Reagan related things, obviously did a lot for the Reagan Foundation and for the Reagans, stayed connected with them for the next 5 years while he was still living. And so that was very much still a part of what I did and who I was. But definitely the focus and the priority for a few of those years was at home. And then in 2011 was the Reagan Centennial. So it was a year-long celebration of what would have been President Reagan's 100th birthday. And I was asked to come in as a full-time consultant for all of the events and ceremonies that we were having across the nation and around the world. And it seemed like the perfect opportunity to do something that I loved, that I was uniquely qualified for, and sat down with my family and said, okay, what do you think? I've been home primarily for the last few years, but I just think an opportunity like this is too incredible and perfectly suited to pass up. So we as a family said yes. I jumped into a year that was a whirlwind. I traveled, I went everywhere. It was quite the opposite of being at home and primarily with the kids. But by then they were maybe high school, junior high, late elementary school. And my son had a driver's license, which was a game changer. So that was for a year. And then at the end of that, I looked at where the kids were and where our family was and thought, you know what, I've got momentum. Let's see what I can do. And so kind of hung my own shingle, have had my own portfolio of business the last several years, and just wanted the flexibility of still being able to be a mom primarily and a good wife as well, but also to go ahead and pursue professionally some of the things that I really wanted to do. And so to have opportunities like World for Brexit, speaking opportunities, working with political groups, executive assistant groups. In fact, I was on a podcast yesterday with executive assistants in Australia. There's this global community of EAs that, regardless of whether you serve the president of a country, president of a company, there's so much of that skill set and that role that's very similar. And so I do a lot of EA training and speaking, which is fun, a lot of student groups, and just have really enjoyed seeing where the opportunities come. I did this past year, went back to Washington, D.C. for the better part of a year and served in the administration, which was an incredible opportunity to be able to jump back into federal service and to serve a second president in a very different capacity, and honored to serve our nation and the people of this great nation in that role as well.
And are you thinking of running for office someday?
No. No, that's not really in the plan. We will always see where God leads me and what doors he opens, but that certainly is not my plan. So it would have to be his plan.
So take us behind the scenes of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan's life. I mean, you're there for everything. You see all the moments. You're behind the scenes. You're there with them. What was the dynamic of their relationship? I know this is obviously in their older years, but nevertheless, what did you observe?
Yeah. Well, I think whether it's just with Ronald Reagan or with their relationship together, exactly what you thought and hoped that they were, that's actually who they were. And so Ronald Reagan in front of the camera was the exact same person behind the camera as well. When the cameras weren't rolling, when he thought nobody was watching, that's exactly who he was. And same with Mrs. Reagan and their relationship. They were incredibly cute together. And here was an older couple. They had been married a long time, but you would always find them hugging or kissing, or he was always holding her hand. He would have his arm around her. They were never just standing by each other. And, lots of people criticize Mrs. Reagan for that gaze she would give him when he was talking at public events. But having seen them behind the scenes, that was how she looked at him all the time. And what was interesting that people didn't really see was that he had that same gaze and that same look toward her. And if she was talking, if she was being honored, if she was speaking someplace, he had that same look of adoration, of affection, of such a genuine delight in her. They truly enjoyed each other. They were two pieces of a puzzle that fit together perfectly, and they completed and complemented each other beautifully. And I really don't think we would have had the Ronald Reagan we had without the Nancy Reagan we had. They were very different, and she brought out the best in him for the world to see and for the nation to benefit from.
And did they ever have arguments with each other that you observed?
They certainly had their disagreements. Mrs. Reagan made sure to let him know if she was not happy, but it it was never anything extended, just the typical little, bark that sometimes the spouse gives the other, but even those were pretty rare. And they truly enjoyed each other's company. They enjoyed it above anything and anyone else. And even if they were in an event, they couldn't wait to get back in the car and get back home where it would just be the two of them.
I asked one of his aides, Peter Hannaford, this question, but did you ever see signs of a flash of temper or anything like that?
No, it's so funny because the only time I ever saw any temper at all coming out of the president, I was walking past his office one day and he took his pencil and kind of threw it down at the desk. And I remember it just sort of struck me because I had never seen any sort of temper at all. I don't know whether maybe the pencil lead broke or I don't know what had happened, but it was just that one little moment. And it's so funny that something so benign and small stands out in my mind, but that was really the only time I ever saw any sort of a temper. Now, I will tell you the thing that was most important to him that would irritate him, and I don't know if it qualifies as being a temper, but he hated being late to things. And it really annoyed him when people were late, especially to meetings with him, because he saw promptness as being a sign of respect. And if you respected a person, you would be there on time, you would stick to the time schedule that was allotted. And so that to him was the way you showed respect. And I used to hate it every now and then if an appointment was running late and I had to walk in and I had to say, Mr. President, I'm so sorry, but your next appointment called and they're running a few minutes late. And he would just look at me, not angry, but just sort of puzzled, as if, how does anybody run late? Why would you do that? And how does that happen? And so more just puzzled by the fact that somebody would be late, because for us, it was important that we always kept on time. I always watched the clock, watched the calendar, but he did too. And so every now and then he'd pop out of his office and say, okay, I'm ready to go. And I'd say, Mr. President, we have 3 minutes. I need to finish something up. But that was very important to him. So whether that rises to the level of a temper, I don't know, but that was certainly something that was important to him, and that you would see him get irritated about a little bit if somebody was running late or if our movements were running late.
So the best you can do for me is that he got mad at his pencil one time.
That's all I've got, Mark. That's all I got.
Said the one time that he got angry, or he would get angry, was he scheduled?
I mean, the man was not a saint, but good grief, he was pretty darn close. And, after working for him for 10 years, I think most people, the more you get to know him, a lot of times the shine and the luster kind of goes away. But he was one of those few people that I think, regardless of how high a pedestal you put him on, the more you got to know him, I would just sometimes sit back in awe and say, wow, he really is that good of a person. He just really was. So.
Yeah, I was going to tell you that Peter Hannaford said the one time he got angry was when they would overschedule him.
Oh, yeah. We did not compare notes, but that definitely is a timing issue for sure. And that was important to him.
Threw his glasses down the table and said, I cannot do all this in one day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scheduling, interesting. Both involve scheduling.
Yeah.
So your duties really encompassed a lot of things. I mean, you were not only handling the meet and greets many times for people, but also just personal assistant and traveling with them. What kind of, give us the range of things you did?
Yeah. Well, in the White House, he has somebody to do everything, and he's got hundreds, if not thousands of people at his fingertips to do anything and everything. And when he left the White House and came to LA, he came out with a staff of maybe about 12 people. And then over the course of those 10 years, typically as people left, we didn't replace them. And so the jobs just got consolidated. And I think by the time he left the office for good, there was maybe 3 or 4 of us working for him. And so that office continued to scale down, and with it, the duties sort of piled up on everybody in different capacities. And so we had a scheduling office that would schedule people. But then, for instance, if somebody like you was coming in, I would meet you at the front. I would give you a rundown of how the appointment would go and the timing of it. I would bring you in, have you sign the guest book. If there was a meal to be served or a snack to be served, I would bring that in. Afterwards, I would clear the dishes. I would have the camera hanging around my neck, and I would be the photographer for your visit as well. And then after the visit, I would walk you out. I would send the film back in the day to the lab to get printed. We would get the prints back. I would mat them. I would have the president sign them. I would address them and mail them out. And so it was kind of a whole range of things. And then, of course, anything and everything that had to do with him, with his schedule, with his correspondence. We had a correspondence office that opened all of his mail and categorized it. And so they would bring a stack of things every week for him to read just for his interest. A lot of times he would choose to respond, but if there was something that needed to be drafted in response to a head of state or just to somebody from the public who had written in, I would also draft that. He always improved that letter, I will tell you. And a lot of times he would take my draft that I had written and he would just pull out pen and paper and write something himself. And sometimes he would bring it to my desk and he'd say, Peggy, can you type this and send this out? And I would look at this beautifully handwritten letter and I'd say, respectfully, Mr. President, I think they'd rather have this copy. So I'd make a copy of it for the file and send out the original from his pen, which obviously was very special.
Yeah. When did you first notice signs of Alzheimer's?
Yeah. I write about this in my book, and even writing a book, I wasn't sure how I felt about that because there's a certain privacy and responsibility that comes with working in close proximity to somebody like a world leader like Ronald Reagan. But my opinion was very changed. I spoke at a conference several years ago, and there was a gentleman who runs a presidential history project, and he said, after I had spoken, he said, "Oh, you have to write a book and tell your story." And I kind of pushed back and said, I don't think I would ever do that. It just doesn't seem appropriate. But he said something to me that completely changed my mind. And he said, if there was a woman who sat outside Abraham Lincoln's office door every day for 10 years, don't you think we would want to know what she saw, what she learned, what she observed? And don't you think she would owe it to history to tell us? Well, I still wasn't going to write a book, but that definitely changed my thinking on it. And when I did get to the point where I was approached about writing a book, I decided that obviously it needed to be revealing. It needed to show a side of him that hadn't been talked about, that nobody had the opportunity to see once he left the White House. But I also wanted to dispel this idea that he left office, he got Alzheimer's, and he died. Because he left office, and 5 years into his post-presidency, those first 5 years were very active. I write about the travel and the speeches and the meetings he did. And then 5 years in, he announces to the world he has Alzheimer's. And certainly, and again, I write about this in my book, there were times ahead of time that I wasn't sure what exactly was happening, but I thought something was a little off. I sort of chalked it up to he was an older gentleman, and older people sometimes are forgetful or repeat a story or say something that just seems a little off. But I kind of chalked it up to that because before Ronald Reagan made his announcement of Alzheimer's, if you recall, there was really no information about that. Nobody really knew what it was, had really even heard of it. And like I said before, the families that had somebody with Alzheimer's, there was a lot of shame surrounding that, and they kind of kept those people hidden, and there just wasn't a lot known about it. But 5 years in, Ronald Reagan announces to the world that he has Alzheimer's, and none of us really know what those next few years or months look like. We had no idea how long this would go on. But I love the fact that even though he announced this, that he didn't go hiding away. And you even came in during those last 5 years, and he easily could have retired to the ranch and not seen anybody or talked to anybody. But instead, he chose to live life as best as he could, as long as he could. And really, the world started saying goodbye to him when he wrote that letter. But I was still saying good morning to him almost every day for the next 5 years. And as a young person, especially, what an impact that made on me, that, aging is not a death wish in that regard, that you can choose to live life to the fullest and continue to throttle into life as best as you can, as long as you can. And what a great example he was, and Mrs. Reagan too, for encouraging him to go ahead and keep living and not figure out how to die, but instead figure out how to live.
But you probably noticed quite a while before the letter went out?
I did. And it got to the point where it was a little bit concerning. And, I talked to some of the staff, but we knew he had an appointment at the Mayo Clinic and coming up. And so we had kind of shared some of the things that we had seen and were concerned about. But we knew that the doctors would get to the bottom of it. And that was his diagnosis. But again, it wasn't like you could come home and Google Alzheimer's disease and see all this. I remember going to the library and trying to find anything on, I mean, even in the day, it was just called senility or dementia or old age, and Alzheimer's wasn't really a known quantity. And I remember finding one book at the library that was kind of sort of about something along those lines. But that was it. There was no support groups. There was no chat rooms online. I mean, it was really, especially for the Reagans, a very lonely journey. And so those of us who were part of it wanted to be supportive, wanted to do what was best, but obviously didn't always know what was best. And so, I decided that rather than being worried about what was right or wrong or formal or proper, especially for the former president, that I would just lean in with love and what was the most loving thing to do, what was the most caring thing to do, how would I want him treated if he was my own grandfather. And so maybe when you said you witnessed a little bit of that, it was not running such a tight, rigid schedule, but learning to have more of a softness at the office and more of a calming and a comforting presence, because I knew when everything was different in his world that I was the one face that was there, that was familiar, that was calming and comforting to him every day. And what an honor and a privilege to be able to usher that man through incredibly terrifying years, but he did so with dignity and with grace and with faith, and taught us all how to live.
Did you help him, or did the staff help with the letter?
He wrote that letter himself. And then certainly we were part of distributing it to the world. But I remember holding the letter and reading it for the first time and not only being personally devastated and professionally wondering what that meant, but I pictured all the people across the nation and around the world who were about to read that as well. And here was their hero, somebody they had admired and looked up to and loved and respected for so many years. And he was like a knight on a stallion. And all of a sudden, he had a chink in his armor. And we were going to see this heroic figure who was larger than life, who took on the Soviet Union and made the wall come down, become human. And I knew and I felt what people would feel when they heard this. And after the letter went out, the outpouring of affection and love and respect and gratitude to this man was overwhelming. And reading these letters every day, I kind of had to keep my own emotions in check, but beautiful letters about how people had been inspired by him and their lives had forever been changed by him. And again, just reminded me how fortunate I was to be in a place like that and to serve him in a way that I think any of those people, if they had had an opportunity to thank him and to serve him, would have done so as well.
And did he discuss any of the disease with you guys on the staff? Did you ever have a meeting and he talked about it?
I mean, we did talk about it, but again, there was more questions than answers. There was so much that was unknown. We agreed to be flexible, to continue to communicate. Mrs. Reagan and I obviously had communicated quite a bit during the previous years that I had worked there, but communication with her became key. It became more frequent, it became more honest and open, and I wanted her to know how his day was, what was good, what maybe wasn't working. We would talk with her about strategies of maybe what was a better way to approach something. And so she and I worked very closely, and she did such a beautiful job of caring for him beautifully at home, supporting him when he was out in public. And really, she was somebody who loved being behind the scenes behind him. And she had to step up and be in the forefront during those final years of his life. And that was a place I know she didn't prefer and she wouldn't have chosen, but she loved that man so much, and she wanted to continue to advocate for his legacy, to be an advocate for his life, and to talk about the wonderful things that he had done for our nation and the world. And so she put aside, I think, her own unwillingness to do that in order to be willing to perpetuate the things that she knew were important about her husband for the world to see.
What was a typical day like for him? What was the typical schedule?
Yeah. So in the early years, it depended on if we were traveling or not, but a typical day in the office, he would come in maybe around 9 o'clock in the morning. I would go down to the car and I would meet him. And we had this little White House canvas bag that every day at the end of the day, we would send home with him he would call her his roommate. And it would have letters and pictures and things for her to sign, things for her to read. And of course, we could have given it to Secret Service, but he wanted to take this little bag of work, basically, to Mrs. Reagan himself. So in the morning, I would meet him at the car, and he would bring out his little canvas bag and hand it to me at the car and say, "This is from my roommate." And I said, "I'll take care of that, Mr. President." And we would walk up through the building, and a lot of times people would stop and stare. And again, I'm dating myself, but this is pre-cell phones. And so there weren't people stopping him to take selfies or anything like that. But if there was people who happened to have a camera, a lot of people wanted to always stop and take a picture with him if they could, or just say hello and thank him and shake his hand. And so it was always a little bit of a challenge even getting him from the car to the elevator. But we would get in the elevator. The building was Fox Plaza, next to the Fox Studios there in Century City. We had the whole 34th floor, which had Secret Service. It had Mrs. Reagan's foundation there. It originally had the Reagan Foundation offices before they even had the library. And obviously then the personal staff office of the president. And so we would go up to the 34th floor, which was very secured, bulletproof glass, all the codes and keys and things to get in. But once you were in, as you know, it was warm, it was welcoming, it was patriotic. You felt like it was important, but you also felt like you belonged there. It had a conference room, a little waiting area, the staff offices, and then his office, which had a beautiful panoramic view overlooking primarily Santa Monica, the beach, the airport there at Santa Monica, where you could watch planes land from his office window. And so it was a beautiful place. And he would come in around 9. Usually I would have his schedule on his desk. I would have newspapers out. Always had gone through the newspaper and folded the funnies so they were on the top. And that would be on the top of his reading pile because he always enjoyed looking through the funnies first. And then we'd do some reading, and then it just depended on the day. Usually his appointments started about 10 o'clock. So we would usually take the morning to do any reading he needed to do, writing, talk through speeches, talk through travel, talk through schedule, any of those things to get his weigh in on what was coming up. And usually his appointments would start around 10, and it was everybody from world leaders to the president of the United States to people who would work for him, people who had written in, any variety of people came through the office. He would have his lunch there in the office. The hotel next door actually would cater his lunch. It was almost like room service, and they would bring it up like a room service tray and set it out, and he would eat primarily in his office, usually alone. Every now and then somebody would join him. We tried to fairly often do a staff lunch, so we would have a big staff lunch in the conference room, which he seemed to enjoy as well. And then he would usually be in the office until maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and then go home and enjoy some time in the afternoon with Mrs. Reagan, or swim in the pool, or work out at the gym. He was always very active. He had a trainer that worked out with him. Secret Service would talk about walking in on him doing push-ups on the floor. I mean, the guy was really fit. Fridays, a lot of times he would play golf. In the early years, especially, they would sometimes go up to the ranch maybe for 5 days or for a week during the month. And so, we tried to give him a chance to, yes, be retired, but also he wanted to stay very engaged in what was happening in the dialogue of the day as well.
And would he go for walks? I think he would go to the park.
Yeah.
Century City Park.
We would. So sometimes, on the way home, we'd stop and do a little walk in the park. Sometimes if it was a beautiful day and his afternoon was clear, I would look out the window and say, "Mr. President, looks like a beautiful day down at the beach today. Would you like to have lunch at the beach club?" And so we would call and go down to the Jonathan Beach Club, and there in Santa Monica, right at the base of the California incline and sit out on the patio and have lunch and then go for a walk out on the boardwalk of the beach as well. So we did try to get him outside as much as possible. And on the days when it wasn't possible to do that, sometimes we would just take him to the roof of the office building and call building security, have them let us up there. And you can imagine that top floor, that panoramic view from the helicopter pad. You had a 360-degree view of Los Angeles, which was beautiful. And he had been in Los Angeles so long. I used to love to stand up there with him. And he had these big Secret Service issued binoculars that you could see forever in. And so he would look between the trees and say, "Oh, I can see my house. I wonder if Mrs. Reagan would go outside and wave to me." You could see the planes land in Santa Monica. You could see the beach. You could see down even on a clear day to the port, down in San Pedro. I mean, you could see everywhere, the golf courses, the homes, and he would tell little stories about early LA, about places he knew and things he remembered. And so how special to be up there on the rooftop in the middle of a beautiful LA day with this man who loved LA and had spent so much time there.
Yeah, wasn't the building the Die Hard Nakatomi Plaza building?
It was. So if you've seen the movie Die Hard, it's the Nakatomi Plaza, and they, pretended to blow it up not long before he moved in. And if you've seen the movie, there's a scene where Bruce Willis is bleeding and he's in a bathroom and bandaging himself up. And apparently that was the president's bathroom before the building was completed. But we actually watched the movie with the president one day in the conference room. I think we had a staff lunch and did that. And it was so funny because he kept looking around the office and said, "Well, they did a good job putting this place back together," but yeah, it was the Nakatomi Towers. And so it's funny when I see that because it's the elevator bays, it's the lobby. Definitely, it's very distinguishable.
So they literally shot it on the floor you were on.
Yes. Yes, before he had moved in. And so before it was finished, it's my understanding that they shot it up there on the 34th floor.
Is there anything surprising about him that you learned that maybe he, as an aside, said, "Hey, Peggy, this or that"? Anything that historians missed that you might have picked up?
I think since I worked for him so young, I didn't know what to expect, but I had this idea of what people at the top look like. And I guess I thought you had to choose one of two paths in life. You could choose to be strong and successful, or you could be a kind, good person. And I met in Ronald Reagan somebody who had navigated both. Nobody argued that he was strong and successful. He had been president of the United States. He went toe to toe with the Soviet Union. The wall came down. Strong, successful, yes. But then also behind the scenes, there was this man who was kind and warm and attentive and thoughtful and very appreciative and lived a life of gratitude and optimism and humility and authenticity. And to me, that was very surprising because especially as a young person, I thought you had to pick. Depicted in the movie are the fist pounders on the desk and the yellers and the screamers, and those are always the boss. But to have a boss who gave me loyalty before I had maybe even earned it and never demanded anything from me, but gave to me first. And then it made me want to reciprocate in amazing ways. I mean, our office, as stressful and busy as it was, none of that stress or pressure came from him. It came from us wanting to serve him in the way he should be served and wanting never to disappoint him or to let him down or clearly not ever put him in danger by not, communicating clearly with Secret Service or making a misstep or having a typo in a letter, or anything from large to small. There was this pressure we put on ourselves to serve him with excellence because we knew he trusted us. And as much as there were those moments that I wanted to just linger in forever, and I do have those snapshots in my mind, I knew I had a job to do. And my job was not to just keep up with him, it was to keep 3 steps ahead of him. And I never wanted to let him down. And so I guess my idea of what a boss looks like was really shattered, but in a wonderful way, by having Ronald Reagan for my boss. And by the way, he ruined me because I will never have a better boss than that. It's never going to happen.
And what was the process? How did you end up leaving? What was that process like?
Leaving the office, you mean? Yeah. I had had my third baby, and had left on a maternity leave, but had this urgent feeling that I just wanted to get back to the office. And so she was only maybe a month or 6 weeks old. And I returned to the office and was back to my routine. The president obviously had not been coming into the office as much, but my hope was that he eventually would return. And 1 week turned into 2 weeks, turned into a month, and there just wasn't a good day for him to come to the office. And so after being there for a few months, after talking with Mrs. Reagan, I just decided that the heartstrings of my life were tugging me home as much as the heartstrings of my profession had tugged me there for so many years. And I didn't need to push papers for the government. I needed to be home with my family, and I could rest easy that I had served him to my very best to the very end. And so I tendered my resignation after 10 years at the office of Ronald Reagan. And there was a little party in the conference room, and I rode that elevator down to my car for the very last time. And it was heartbreaking, but at the same time, there was this wonderful feeling that I had completed my service, that I had seen it through to the end. There was always this fear of, oh no, what if I can't make it to the end? What if it's too hard? What if I, just don't have what it takes to see it through? And so there was this great feeling of satisfaction and completion that I saw it through to the end. And for Mrs. Reagan to be so gracious and to allow me to continue to see him, I would go up to the house quite often, sometimes with the kids, sometimes by myself, and sit and talk with him, or just sit and hold his hand and watch the beautiful skyline from the back patio of their house, and just look at that profile to the side of me and just think, wow, how fortunate I am to be in this place, to have known this man, to have had an opportunity to serve him like so many others would have done so had they had the privilege of doing so. And to see him end those final years so well taken care of, so comfortable, in just such a calm and peaceful setting. There was a beauty in his passing, if you can say that, because it was such a life well lived. It was a life of faith and of trusting God. He had trusted God with every step of his life, and trusted him even in that at the very end. And so, what a testament to a long, fruitful, productive, and faithful life. And it was beautiful.
What were the last visits like? How cognizant was he? How aware was he of you, etc.?
Yeah. They varied. I actually write about three particular visits that stood out in my mind, in my book. One is the last time that I took the kids up to see him. And I remember sitting in the backyard. It was a beautiful spring or summer day. And, the kids were playing on the grass and had brought coloring books. It was like going to visit grandma and grandpa, sitting on the back porch and coloring, while I got to visit with the president, and mostly just to sit with him in silence and tell him everything that I wanted to say, how much I was grateful for his example and for his allowing me the opportunity to serve him. And, watching the kids say what I thought would probably be their final goodbye, was hard, but I knew their lives were forever changed and better because of it. And it's cute because even when they'll hear the president's voice, on a speech or on their TV or something, my daughter, she said the other day, she heard his voice and she said, "Mom, I hear his voice and I just feel safe." And I thought, these kids, from the time they were literally in my womb, heard the voice of the great communicator and had that voice pour into their lives in those formative years when they didn't know he was anybody important or special. He was mom's boss and a fun place to go and visit. But to realize that this iconic man had loved them and welcomed them is something I treasure forever. So another time I remember visiting the house, and Mrs. Reagan and I had talked ahead of time, and she was going to be out for a few hours. And so it was perfect timing for me to come up to the house and spend some time with the president while she was out. And I remember being led into the house and walking through the house and seeing him sitting on the back patio, which was not unusual for him to sit out there. It was a beautiful view, and LA, of course, has incredible weather. But what I noticed about this particular visit was that instead of the Secret Service agent who was typically would have been posted back by the sliding glass door, he was sitting next to him. And I thought that was really sweet. And as I approached, I noticed that actually the Secret Service agent was sitting there holding the president's hand. And what a beautiful, tender moment of connection between these two men. And he kind of turned and saw me and got up almost embarrassed. But I thought that was the type of person that President Reagan was, that it elicited this kind of support and affection and love. And here was the Secret Serviceman who was supposed to just be doing his job and protecting the president, but took it to that next level and was connected to him personally and wanted to make sure that he was okay and that he was comforted, even in a time which was probably confusing and scary for him. And so there were so many moments like that, and to be able to witness something like that. And, I also write about my final goodbye at the president's bedside and just being able to tell him how grateful I was for all he had done for me, for my life, how grateful I was for the opportunity to have served him and to thank him for changing my life forever.
When you wrote your book, how difficult was that? And I mean, did you see yourself as an author? Did it take a while for you to see yourself in that way, or had you always thought about writing a book?
Yeah, no, I had no plan of ever doing that. In fact, people always said, "Oh, did you keep notes all those years?" And of course, my parents every day said, "Oh, you should write something in your journal." And I was not good like Ronald Reagan, who kept a diary every day of his presidency. I did not really keep any notes during those years at all. And so, as much as I was disappointed by that, I have to say that the book product that came out was far more genuine, because instead of relying on what we did and where we went and who we met and saw, I really had to dig deep and think about what it meant. And so, what were those moments over the course of 10 years when there were thousands of appointments, when there were dozens of trips, when it was, yes, it was incredible, but it also was a job 5 days a week for 10 years. And so, what were the things that were those pivotal moments that rose to the top to write about? And there definitely, when I stopped and thought about it, there were several. And so my goal with writing the book was, in essence, to put on a pair of glasses and allow people to see him as I saw him, to be in the room and in those moments that did rise to the top. And everything from a little boy with Asperger's syndrome who was obsessed with Ronald Reagan, who came in to see the president and had memorized every fact about Ronald Reagan. And so to watch this little boy struggle with communicating with the great communicator, and telling Ronald Reagan stories about himself, and then kind of correcting the president when he thought the president got it wrong because he remembered reading it differently. But the cameras weren't rolling. Nobody was watching. This wasn't a press avail. And to watch this beautiful moment between this little boy who struggled with everyday things to interact with this man who had literally changed the world was definitely one of those moments. There was another moment that I will never forget, and it's seared in my mind. And so when I was writing about it, it was almost as if I was there again, seeing it replay in my mind. And this very elderly woman from Romania had written into the office and asked for an opportunity to meet Ronald Reagan. And she was your typical looking grandmother, very stooped over. And, the years, you could tell, had been very difficult to her, a little handbag on her arm, shuffling with her steps. And she was very short, and she walked in and she looked up at President Reagan and she dropped to his feet and she started sobbing and kissing his feet. And the president kind of looked at me and then reached down and brought her up to stand. And as she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face in her very broken English, she thanked him for freeing her, for freeing her family, for freeing her people from oppression. And as I watched that moment, I thought of all the people all around the world that, if they had had that same opportunity to meet Ronald Reagan, would have also dropped to his feet and kissed his feet and sobbed and wept and thanked him for their freedom. And somehow this little old woman from Romania had traced the dots of her freedom back to the feet of this man. And to be able to witness things like that time and time again can't help but change you and inspire you to live a life that's worthy of that kind of calling.
And your book is entitled "The President Will See You Now."
Yes.
I'm pretty sure that's what you told me when you.
It probably is. I said that phrase many a time over the course of 10 years, and it was never something I took for granted because I knew for most people that was the most thrilling and exciting moment of their life. And I remember that first moment meeting the president for the first time, and I wanted people to have that special moment. And Ronald Reagan was very intentional about making sure that those moments were special. For him, it was ordinary, it was routine, it was every day, but being very intentional about seeing people, recognizing them, looking in their eyes, making them feel valued and important. He was so good at that. And it wasn't an act. It was actually who he was. He cared about people. He didn't think he was any better than anybody else. He had lived out what he was called to do in life. And if you were doing the same, then we were all equals.
Well, thanks, Peggy, for visiting with us today. You're a great role model, and I wish you the best of success in your next ventures and your next book, probably.
Thank you. I'm not committing, but we may. We'll see. Thank you,
Okay.
Mark, for having me. My best of luck to you and the team for the movie.